Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Religion and Nationalism panel. We're just going to wait a few seconds for everybody to fill in the webinar. So just a few seconds here, and we will get going. Welcome, everyone, to the panel Religion and Nationalism. Is being sponsored by the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, together with the Center for Religion and Culture at Fordham University. I think it's one of the first times that we're co-sponsoring something with CRC. We're very excited about that. And we invite you to visit our websites. I won't give you the address because you just Google Orthodox Christian Studies Center or Center for Religion and Culture at Fordham University, and they'll pop up and you'll see there all the events. We invite you to kind of browse and to look at our events. So we have a YouTube, each of our centers has a YouTube page. We invite you to kind of see our content there. Perhaps you may, if you're so inclined, perhaps like some of that content so as to affect the algorithm and let other people know that that kind of content exists as well. Before I move to introducing our what's really kind of an all-star panel here, we're very excited and honored to have all of them here. Just let me kind of signal that we are going to have a part 2 of this sort of religion and nationalism conversation. And that part 2 is going to be on November 5th, after the election. And it's going to feature Gregory's colleague, Eddie Glaude, Robert Jones, Christina Stockel, and it's going to be moderated by David Gibson. So we do invite you to go and register for that event, which promises to be very exciting, especially after the election. Also for the Orthodox Christian Studies Center, if I may, we're going to have on November 6th, the day after the November 5th panel, Orthodoxy and Anthropology in Conversation at 1 p.m. And the next in our Women Scholars of Orthodox Christianity series on November 16th at 4 p.m., featuring Evi Fokas, who is a scholar in Greece, doing tremendous work also on, well, issues on religion and nationalism and religion and religious freedom and politics in Europe especially. So without further ado, again, I think this panel really doesn't need me. It can run by itself. It can have a conversation by itself. Even though I'm moderating, I think I'm going to be more someone just kind of excited to listen in to the kind of conversation that will occur over the next hour or so. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists, but also right before I do that, I just want to remind everybody there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we invite you to kind of throughout the session here to offer your questions. And we'll probably, just to give you some sense, what we're going to have is each of our panelists is going to speak for about 10 minutes each. Then I'm going to invite the panelists, perhaps offer some additional comment, perhaps on something that was mentioned in those presentations. And that right around 5:45 or so, we are going to kind of turn it over to question and answer. So during that time, please do offer your questions at the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, let me do the introductions. First, we have José Casanova, who is a world-renowned sociologist of religion, is a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and emeritus professor, just recently emeritus professor of sociology and theology and religious studies at Georgetown University. From 1987 to 2007, he served as professor of sociology at the New School for Social Research in New York. In his book, Public Religions in the Modern World, has become a modern classic and has really defined the conversation, and has been translated into many languages, including Japanese, Arabic, and Turkish. He's also the author of Europa's Angst vor der Religion in Berlin, genealogías de secularización. How did I do, Jose? Did I do okay? Yeah, I think I did okay, because the Greek and the Spanish pronunciations are very similar. Beyond secularization and global religious and secular dynamics. And recently he co-edited The Jesuits and Globalization and Islam, Gender and Democracy in Comparative Perspective. So after Jose speaks, immediately, without my intervention, Elizabeth Prodromou will offer her presentation, and she's a faculty member at the Fletcher School of Law and Democracy at Tufts University, where she directs the Initiative on Religion, Law, and Diplomacy. She's non-resident senior fellow and co-chair of the Working Group on Christians and Religious Pluralism in the Middle East at the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute, and was non-resident senior fellow in National Security and the Middle East at the Center for American Progress. She is a co-president of Religions for Peace. Prodromou served as vice chair and commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom from 2004 to 2012, and was a member of the U.S. Secretary of State's Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group from 2011-2015. Her research interests focus on geopolitics and religion, with particular focus on the Middle East, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Southeastern Europe. Her current research projects concentrate on cultural heritage and institutional religious freedom in Turkey, as well as Eastern Orthodox Christianity in context of religious pluralism. The author of multiple edited volumes and many publications in scholarly and policy journals. In fact, we've worked together on one particular volume. Prodromou is a frequent commentator and contributor in US and international media. She holds a PhD in SM in political science from MIT, an MALD in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a BA in history and international relations from Tufts University. And then we will have Eric Gregory, who is a professor of religion and chair of Humanities Council at Princeton University. His research and teaching spans religious and philosophical ethics, theology, political theory, and the role of religion in public life. In addition to articles and scholarly reviews, he is the author of Politics in the Order of Love, an Augustinian Ethic of Democratic Citizenship, a great book. A graduate of Harvard College, he earned an MPhil and diploma in theology from the University of Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, where he studied with Kallistos Ware, the great Orthodox thinker and theologian, and his doctorate in religious studies is from Yale University. He has received fellowships from the University of Notre Dame, Harvard University, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the New York University School of Law. Among his current projects is a book tentatively titled The Ingathering of Strangers, Global Justice and Political Theology, which examines secular and religious perspectives on global justice. In 2007, he was awarded Princeton's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching. So we will go in the order of José Casanova, Elizabeth Prodromou, Eric Gregory. Each will have 10 minutes. And just as a final word, the flow of the conversation will be from the global perspective, insights and perspective in the Orthodox world, and then kind of coming into the national scene here into the United States. And then we'll allow each of them, because each of them are experts really in all these areas, we'll allow each of them to kind of comment further after the presentations. So without further ado, I'm going to go on mute and I hand it over to José Casanova. José.
Well, good evening, everybody. And thank you, Telly, for the kind introduction and for the Spanish pronunciation. That was very good. I want to make 3 points. One, religious nationalism is ubiquitous, meaning it's basically you find it everywhere. At some point in every country in the world, you have had some form of religious nationalism. It's common to all religious traditions, to the Christian traditions, the main one, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, etc. So it is ubiquitous. It's a global phenomenon in this respect. I myself come from Spain, grew up under the Franco regime that can best be characterized as a political regime as national Catholicism. It was a form of national Catholicism. And so even within Catholic countries, which are supposed to be transnational and have a transnational structure, you have very clear forms of Catholic nationalism. The high point of religious nationalism in Europe was World War I, when basically every church supported the national war effort. Every Protestant church, every Catholic church, every Orthodox church, everywhere in the war in Europe supported the Catholic effort. This was a time precisely when it was a fusion almost of church and state in the war effort. Second point, nationalism can be understood, and many people have so analyzed, as a form of secular civil religion. The great theories of nationalism, Benedict Anderson, call the nation a form of secularized church. So the question is, if nationalism is a form of civil religion or secular religion, the main question is, what is its relationship of this secular religion with the ecclesiastical religion? And basically you have three models throughout Europe and then throughout the world. One is relatively fusion of church, state, and nation. The Scandinavian model is the most clear, because ecclesiologically, every Lutheran church is a Landeskirche. There is no transnational Lutheran community, commonwealth. But also similarly in the Orthodox churches, because of the combination of ecclesiology, autocephaly, being a characteristic of the Orthodox tradition, but also because under the conditions of the fall of the Ottoman Empire, or the process of independence of Orthodox countries, every Orthodox country claims simultaneously independence from the Ottoman Empire, but also autocephaly, independence from the ecumenical patriarch. So it is, in this respect, nationalism and autocephaly grew together throughout the Orthodox world that had been part of the Ottoman Empire. But you could argue similarly about the Russian Empire and the unfolding what happens after. The second model is that of conflict between the secular civil religion and the church. France, of course, is the model, a republican laïcité against Catholic nationalism. For 100 years, you have almost a civil war between the two principles. Eventually, the republican laïcité triumphed. And this has been a common phenomenon in many, many Catholic countries. In my own country, Spain, we have 3 civil wars, 2 in the 19th century, one in the 20th century, over which kind of nation, should be a Catholic nation or a non-Catholic nation. And it was always precisely a fundamental point of conflict, how to organize nationalism in Catholic countries. At the time precisely when the Catholic Church was, to a certain extent, against nationalism because of the papacy and the conflict with Italian nationalism, and against liberalism. And then you have a third model. So you have a model of a civil religion, which is basically fused to the ecclesiastical religion, either a Lutheran or an Orthodox civil religion. One, which you have a secular civil religion against the ecclesiastical religion, and there the American model of a civil religion which is non-denominational, which is basically, on the one hand, you have a separation of a secular state, but then you have a form of what Robert Bellah calls civil religion, which is shared by all Americans, but it is not in conflict with the denominations because all the religious denominations support the civil religion. Here, the question is at which point in the history of the United States you have elements of attempts of the religious majority, either Protestantism in the 19th century, or today we'll be talking about Christian nationalism, attempts to present itself as the religion of the civil religion of the United States, rather than this non-denominational civil religion. And then talking about the globalization, precisely, although the nation state emerged in Europe, and the concept of religion as the modern class of religion emerges out in Europe, they become globalized. The religious secular divide becomes globalized, and the nation state becomes globalized. And in this process, these same dynamics reproduce themselves across the world in non-Western countries. Let's look at Islam. Islam, which is supposed to be its own kind of model? Well, you have models like the Scandinavian. Morocco, you could say, has a kind of a fusion of kingdom, the king, the state, the government, Islam, and the Moroccan nation. And it works rather without much conflict, the way it happens in Scandinavia. Then you have Ataturk, Turkey, which of course was a model of laicity against Islam, turning Islam into a religion controlled by the state. It was a national religion controlled by the state, and leading to conflicts between basically the secular state and Muslim movements religion. And then you have a country like Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, that had a civil religion, the Pancasila movement, the 5 principles, which Islam is the majority religion, but the civil religion of Indonesian nationalism is not Islamic. But of course, you have Muslim movements. They will try to turn into a Muslim Indonesian nationalism. Senegal is another Muslim country in which also claims to be laïcité, but bien entendu. So they copy laïcité from the French, but precisely in order to protect religious pluralism, to protect the religious minorities, especially the Murid brotherhoods and other brotherhoods, from any notion of an Islamic state. So again, those are the 3 main points I wanted to make to start the conversation. And now I turn over the floor to my dear friend, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Jose. And thank you to the organizers, to Telly and to the Orthodox Christian Studies Center and to the Fordham Center on Religion and Culture. It's great to be part of this panel. Jose, every time I'm on a panel with you, I always have to get over the fact that I feel like I'm climbing up Mount Olympus and I'm beginning to approach somebody on the top of the mountain, because I remember when you actually signed your newly printed Public Religions in the Modern World for me, and I was just finishing my own doctoral work. So anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you and Eric today. I have an assignment. My assignment was to try to talk a little bit about, and I'm using the formulation that I received, the Orthodox Christian world, and how the Orthodox Christian world might help us think a little bit about religion and nationalism in general, and also maybe what's happening in the United States, but also to sort of unpack what's happening in the Orthodox Christian space. So I've been thinking a lot about this in terms of the run up to the presidential election here in the US. All the data here show that religion in this election has been a more explicit part of the public discourse. Party platforms, policy discussions, voter constituent activity, and even most recently, the confirmation hearings of the newly appointed Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett. The country's political polarization and the hyperpartisanship here in the US has really included very intense debates about religious freedom or religious liberty at home and abroad. And it's also included very intense disagreements about the intersectionality of religion, race, ethnicity, gender. In other words, religion as part of an intersecting identity cluster. And the newly released report by Melissa Rogers and E.J. Dion, it's called A Time to Heal, A Time to Build, Recommendations for the Next Administration, really lays out, I think, very clearly the questions that we're all here discussing today, namely, and makes it clear that these questions are not out there, but they're, as you said, Jose, they're ubiquitous. They're in here in the United States. And so the question of the relationship between religion and nation, religious nationalism, is part of the discussion here in the US as it is in the rest of the world. Now, going from the US to the Orthodox world, I want to start with a very broad statement, and then I'll go directly to the Orthodox. I would say that we're actually at a historical conjuncture when it comes to the relationship between religion and nationalism globally. Because I think what we're witnessing, and again, I love your formulation, Jose, of the ubiquitousness of religious nationalism. What we're witnessing today is a reconfiguration, a reconceptualization, a contestation of the philosophical and the normative questions, and then the political arrangements that have undergirded the international system since the treaties of Westphalia. So basically, we're witnessing a debate about this formulation that we use very easily, the secular nation state. And a key feature of this debate and this reordering and this reconfiguration includes the spread of religious nationalism, or I would say the spiritual and practical weaponization of religion for purposes of exclusivist nationalism at home and revanchist disruptive foreign policies abroad. And the US is part of this conjunctural moment. Now, what does that mean for orthodoxy and the so-called Orthodox Christian world? So a little bit about terminology, because I think the language is really important for how we ask our questions and also the kind of epistemic frameworks we're using. I would use religion, nation, as well as state and secular, and all of these have come up in everything that you spoke about, Jose. But when it comes to those terms, we get a kind of historical narrative and epistemic framework that we all know. The Westphalian international system has been organized according to nation states, wherein the secular political community of the nation of citizens replaced the sacred religious community of believers, organized into territorial units that are controlled by states. Now, according to this narrative, the Orthodox Christian world has been an outlier of those tendencies. And how so? The Orthodox world, and here I'm using this as an equivalent for the core Eurasian geography of Dmitry Obolensky's Byzantine Commonwealth. So Orthodox majority states in the old world, if you will. The Orthodox world has been a geospace that's defined as follows. One, a space that rejects the secularism, nationalism ideological formulation, and instead has relied on a more deliberate, if contested, but nonetheless deliberate and dominant identification of religion and nation, and more specifically of dominant Orthodox identity for the national community. And that's led to real challenges for equal citizenship. But it's also meant that in the Orthodox world, we've seen the emergence of this kind of Orthodox cultural identity, much like what Danielle Leroy-Lager talked about as the Roman Catholic religio-cultural bricolage in her work on France and other places in Western Europe. So a kind of set of assumptions about orthodoxy being associated with belonging and producing implicit, if not explicit, forms of exclusion from a national community that is informed by this Orthodox cultural identity. And then the second thing in the Orthodox world that we've seen is a political space whose constitutions, laws, and politics very much and explicitly link the Orthodox Church to the state, so national churches in that formulation. And that's meant that in public education and military service and economic and security mechanisms, we've seen a kind of religious nationalism that's been very problematic for democracy and more hospitable to hybrid forms of regimes. Now, I'm kind of overstating the narrative, and also throwing into sharp relief some very discernible features. I would reject the Huntingtonian clash of civilizations that says that this is the uniform narrative for the Orthodox world. But I think again there are important features that we do need to take seriously. And what I want to do is suggest that the way that the explanation for these features is one that isn't adequate and doesn't really help us understand what's really been happening and what's happening now. And I would say three things. First, conventional explanations tend to say that to focus on an explanation on orthodoxy as religion. Why do we see this religion nationalism linkage in Orthodox societies? It's something about the orthodoxy qua religion as a faith tradition. Second, it's because of the capacity of churches to dominate states. And third, it's because there's stasis and no change. And I would say that all three of these are errant explanations. If you look at the well springs of Orthodox Christianity, and I'm no theologian, so Telly, forgive me for my mistaken catechism here, but or errors in catechism. But certainly, Orthodox Christianity has provided resources for international human rights protections that we associate with the most important civil and political liberties that are foundational to democracy, and also sees those as universal. So it's not something about orthodoxy, if you will, or that's oversimplifying. Secondly, in terms of the capacity of church to dominate state, I think if we look at cases from Greece to Serbia to Russia to Ukraine, it's difficult to claim that church dominates state. And in fact, what we see is a more complex story of states instrumentalizing church for purposes of nationalism at home and abroad. And then third, with regard to stasis, I think, again, if we historicize and maybe in the discussion period, we can drill down more deeply, we see that there's been a lot of change, but most importantly, it's the moment of state formation that has become crucial for understanding patterns of religion-state relations and religious nationalism, and in particular, the breakup of empires and the emergence from the imperial and colonial spaces of the Ottoman and Russian empires. So what does that mean for today? Just to wrap up, what are we seeing today? We're seeing, in fact, that in Orthodox majority societies, there are very intense debates about religion and nationalism, about religious nationalism. If we look at places like Greece and Montenegro in particular, those are part of the public debate. We're also seeing those same debates in what would have been called the Orthodox diaspora, the global Orthodox community in the US and the UK and Australia, Canada. And we also see more quietly, because more fearfully, those same kind of conversations or in countries in the old world where Orthodox are endangered minorities. And in particular, those conversations involve internal pluralism in Orthodox institutions as well. Those who are in favor of religious nationalism and religion and nationalism connections, and those who reject that. So internal pluralism and orthodoxy is something that we're seeing very much part of the reality of the Orthodox world today. What else are we seeing? We're seeing that the recognition that democratic regime type is absolutely crucial for any capacity to debate, much less rearrange the religion-nation relationship. And what we see is that in societies or countries where there are robust democracies, those debates are far more full-throated and far more intense. But in cases where democracy, where there is no democracy, in cases like Russia, or in a case like Ukraine that has a weak or hybrid sort of democracy, albeit a highly religiously plural country, we see the debates taking place in a less full-throated fashion. In cases, we also see as well that those debates about the religion-nationalism relationship are happening both within theological communities, but also in the broader public sphere. So when we talk about the Orthodox world and the Orthodox Church, we need to take a broad brush approach, a comparative approach, but also one that deconstructs what we mean about that Orthodox space. And then finally, what does this mean for America? I would say democracy is the key to any kind of thoughtful exploration of the religion-nation relationship. Minority-majority status matters in terms of the position that communities take, individuals take as well. Historical experience shapes approaches to religious nationalism, either its acceptance or rejection. Geopolitics matters as well. And then finally, thinking about whether it's states instrumentalizing religion or religions trying to penetrate and colonize and utilize states for purposes of religious nationalism. So I will leave it there and turn it over to you, Eric.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And let me join my distinguished panelists in thanking these two centers at Fordham, whose work I greatly admire, for this invitation and for doing this, albeit virtually, to discuss this important topic. My task was to say something about the United States, put it in dialogue with the Orthodox world, and Telly did give me permission to actually say something theological and not only approach things from a kind of sociological or political sciencey perspective, though I'm a great admirer of those perspectives, as we've just heard. So let me get right to it. From this moment on, it's going to be America first. Thus spoke Donald Trump at his inaugural address, January 2017. Trump wants to make America great again. by which he means whiter and more Christian. Building a wall helps with whitening. So does ripping up international treaties and denial of refuge to refugees. These claims echo precedents in which Christians have invoked the divine name to bless their defenses of nationhood, with leaders of state happy to exploit them, as Elizabeth mentioned. Indeed, on that inauguration day, Robert Jeffress preached a sermon at a service for Trump comparing him to Nehemiah, rebuilding the walls of the nation, delivering it from bondage, restoring a godly nation with a divine mission. As I think we all know, it's hard to read discussions of religion and politics in the US today without stumbling upon criticism of Christian nationalism, especially white evangelical nationalism, as nostalgic, anti-democratic, populist, identity politics bordering on theocracy. Since Trump's election, the fusion of religion and national identity has become a fairly standard object of critique, especially in academic and liberal journalistic circles. A betrayal of the American dream of a democracy of nationalities. I recommend Christian Demez's recent book, Jesus and John Wayne, for just the latest historical examination that argues evangelical support for Trump was not an aberration or merely a pragmatic choice. Let me say from the outset of these brief remarks, ones I fear might be misunderstood, I share these concerns and these criticisms. I do so as a white Protestant, wary of civil religion, the kind of civil religion José spoke about and its complicated role in American public life. I admire some of its high points, think Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King, and even some of those old Puritans who imagined a city on a hill as a warning against injustice, not a timeless election of America as new Israel. But history reveals something messier than the exceptionalist narrative that Americans sometimes tell themselves that we are a nation bound only by shared principles enshrined in our founding documents. I happen to be a civic nationalist, attracted to that ideal story of shared legal values for a free democratic people. I limit my nationalism by internationalism, as with Catholic thinkers like John Courtney Murray and Jacques Maritain. But I know civic nationalism has been allied to various kinds of ethnic and cultural nationalisms in American history, evidenced in recent debates about the New York Times 1619 Project. Civic nationalism can be attractive to the powerful and the privileged as a kind of tidy way of separating the ecclesial and the political, the religious and the secular, the penultimate and the ultimate. But nationalism of any kind, again, I think José hinted at this, easily slides into religious nationalism and tempts idolatry. No one is innocent. What I find interesting about our current moment in the US is the way in which we seem to be trying to negotiate the tension between liberal democracy and the need for national belonging. So what does this have to do with the Orthodox world? America may be a nation with the soul of a church, as G.K. Chesterton famously put it, but it's hard to be a nation or a church of abstract ideas. As much as it appeals to my cosmopolitan intellectual professor side, and also to my Christian side, enchanted by the story of a universal kinship that Augustine used when he warned Christians of his day to not baptize their Romanitas, to see the unity of the human race, to look to Jerusalem above, the great peaceful melting pot of the eschatological kingdom. Early Christians wrestled with the charge they disturbed the divine order. They made Gentiles unintelligible by proclaiming equality in Christ shatters all communities. Christians have another city to love. But in time, we creatures live in social bodies that form distinct vocations before God, with complicated historical relationships to ethnicity, race, language, and culture. Some of the most controversial political issues today in the US, immigration, public education, religious liberty, national symbols, foreign policy, reveal this entanglement. Anti-immigrant fervor was a major reason for Trump's electoral success. It was cited as the most important issue for Obama voters who became Trump voters in the Midwest. Nationally, voters who reported feeling, quote, like strangers in their land were much more likely to favor Trump. While often framed as a debate between a cosmopolitan left and a nationalist right, there is a growing archive of so-called liberal nationalism in America, efforts that defend national identity against cosmopolitanism on the one hand and illiberal nationalism on the other. Nations can secure goods for which it's appropriate to respond with piety. Patriotism is animated by love, nationalism by hatred. So tells us Jill Lepore in her recent book, This America, The Case for the Nation. Or as the Second Vatican Council maintained, quote, citizens must cultivate a generous spirit of patriotism, but without being narrow-minded. I'm cheering for that archive. Call it a patriotism of the left. But I thought I would use my few remaining moments to say something theological about where we are, partly because I'm increasingly convinced that Western theology just doesn't quite know what to say about nations and about national identity, at least since Karl Barth's blistering attack on German nationalism. Is there anything theologically significant or even interesting to say about nations anymore, other than a loud no? Look at all the carnage. I take this to be a slightly different question than the more familiar one of a justifiable patriotism, which some Protestants themselves have thought of as just a form of group egoism. Now, I'm an outsider to the Orthodox Christian world. I'm no expert on its theology, its history, or its lived realities. But I've been intrigued by various proposals now current in the welcome revival of Orthodox political theology. Though my sense is that revival mostly addresses questions of democracy and church and state and modernity more broadly than explicitly the theological question raised by national identity. But what I find revealing in that tradition is a serious wrestling with Catholicity and nationality. What does that mean for Protestants in the United States who instinctively bristle at the idea of a national church or a Christian nation and celebrate the distinctiveness of a unique individual relation to God? A standard Protestant view is nations might be governed by divine providence, but they're not part of salvation history. They are temporal, not eternal. They are natural, even constructed, not supernatural. Orthodoxy, if you forgive this, is viewed as somewhat primitive, even pagan, in its continued flirtation with religious nationalism. Protestants say God saves individuals, not peoples. What counts is grace, not race, as prominent biblical scholar N.T. Wright argued. And why can't everyone just have a First Amendment like the United States? My question in part is whether or not Protestants might need to linger more with the sort of questions Orthodoxy raises, despite its own official condemnations in the Synod of 1872 against the backdrop of the Bulgarian movement, including what, as Telly mentioned, my former teacher, Kallistos Ware, has called the enduring value of national identity eschatologically in the context of the Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Now, there's a lot of nation talk in the Bible. Remember the table of nations in Genesis, the mission to baptize all the nations, the linking of divine providence to the distribution of nations in Acts 17, the assignment of angels to nations in the book of Daniel, the appearance of the nations in the book of Revelation. At the same time, the prophets portray the nations as a mere drop in the bucket, a little dust on the scales of divine judgment. The nations count for nothing, Isaiah says, from the perspective of eternity. Yet, when God gathers all flesh before the divine presence, it's as nations that they assemble. Now, we know the cruel uses to which these images have been put to use in the 19th and 20th century, and well before them. That might explain, I think, why Western theologians have been perplexed by all that talk about Israel and the nations. It often fuels an anti-Jewish polemic in praise of Christian universalism against Jewish nationalism. Now, at the risk of caricature, Orthodox theology, I think, has proved alluring to many because it offers a rich account of a corporate personality, a thickness rooted in shared memory that pushes against what I'll call Protestant Gnosticism, without history, without geography, creatures of spirit. Now, I take it according to the Orthodox tradition, the church is essentially Eucharistic. It gathers the faithful in a particular place. It rejects philotism. The rule of the bishop, however, is not so much ethnic as territorial. Ethnicity, however, is not denied as a reality, just like the Apostle Paul did not deny his Jewishness. There's a unity in diversity that affirms distinct languages, music, liturgical styles, and even ethnic realities. My sense is the Orthodox tradition is more comfortable with the biblical language. Dare I say it's more Hebraic in its Hellenism or Greekness or Russianness or Indianness or Slavness. Again, to quote Tolstoy's Ware, quote, to eliminate from ecclesial life all ethnic and national distinctions would not be a liberation, but an impoverishment. The Orthodox embrace of nationality can be seen maybe as good old-fashioned incarnational theology. Let me draw things to a close. That biblical witness I mentioned is complicated, and I know there are now many strong Orthodox post-national voices who think, well, maybe that's good theology, but look at all the bad politics that ensue from it. Who are those nations, those peoples, those ethne, those goyim, anyway? Now, there's massive scholarly literature on these questions. I don't know how the Orthodox communities reckon with some of that historical scholarship. But whether imagined or not, to invoke Benedict Anderson that José talked about, the nations have not disappeared. None of us live in a world where nations do not matter. As COVID has shown, even as the boundaries among nations matter less and less, they also matter more and more. Rejecting the evils of nationalism, I think, is necessary, a necessary first word. Theologian Stanley Hauerwas famously has argued, last time I was with him at Fordham, that the problem of Christianity in America is the subject has been America, not God. But the late Catholic thinker Richard John Newhouse, perhaps humorously, said when he meets God, he expected to meet him as an American, because the story of America is part of the story of God's world. The gods of the nations are back, maybe back in the US in ways that haven't been noticed before or for some time. So what theologically might we say about nations? Is there a liberal, democratic, Christian nationalism? Or is that an oxymoron? Nations have enough defenders. Stick to criticism. Chasten the grip of political identity. Order your loves. Make politics secular in the religious sense, as Augustine might counsel. We're never fully at home in the world, and we should resist trying to be so. Now, I suspect the Orthodox world has something instructive to say about all this and to teach Americans, and maybe to humble the arrogance of Protestant and increasingly post-Protestant America that has many things it too now wrestles with in a shared way with the Orthodox world. Back to you, Telly.
All right, that was really great. Thank you to all of you. I think we're going to be put back into gallery view where we're all going to be on screen now. And so I want to offer now an opportunity after hearing these really three great and rich presentations. Again, in the same order, perhaps for the speakers, just to simply offer comment, maybe something they heard, maybe something they kind of wanted to sort of fill in the gaps in, something that was said that maybe provoked some form of comment. So Jose, why don't we begin with you?
Well, thank you very much. I'm not sure whether you had planned it this way, Telly, to have a Catholic, a Protestant, and an Orthodox to have a discussion around nationalism. If I should wear my Catholic hat, I could develop a political theology of Catholic nationalism. I mean, you know, after all, Wojtyla was the great Polish nationalist. You couldn't accuse Wojtyla of not being nationalist, and he found he would kiss the earth, the ground of every country where it was. One of the interesting questions about, you say whether there is, I want to make 2 points. One about precisely Christian democracy and how it developed in Europe is a phenomenon. And a second one about the paradox today where you have these transnational coalitions of American evangelicals, Russian Orthodox, and conservative Catholics against the European Union, against cosmopolitanism, etc. So let me first about Christian democracy and the European Union, which actually was a project of Catholic Christian democracy. It was French Catholics that during World War II, in the midst of a war that had lasted for almost 70 years. Russia and France had been at war for 70 years. They had the Franco-Prussian War, then World War I, then World War II, and in between they had been basically at war. And this has been a dynamic of Westphalian European balance of power for 300 years, every nation against nations. And you have French Catholics going to German Catholics during still the end, before the end of the war, saying, you know, we have to find a way out of this. And it was Christian Democrats in France. It was a secular regime. It was a very small party, but it was the French Christian Democrats that led the lead to develop the Christian democracy, basically the European Union, along with German and Italian and the three Dutch and Belgium and Luxembourg. It was the Treaty of Rome, and let's not forget that no single Protestant country joined the European Union, no single socialist basically party was interested in the European Union, and the Gaullists and the nationalists were against the European Union. So it was a Catholic project, but not to transcend the European nations. There was no attempt to transcend, but to create a new structure where you have multinational structures in which nations would not be fighting with one another. So this will be a different model. Again, let's not forget the Latin American Catholic continent. It was one single empire, one single colony, out of which came 23 nations, all the same language, all the same religion, all the same culture, not really clear ethnic divisions. There were a lot of indigenous people, but it was never the ground for the separation of the nations. So you have Catholic nationalism everywhere in Latin America, and there's no way to construct a pan-Latin American political system like European Union in Catholic Latin America. So again, the dynamics of the different religions with nationalism are very, very complex. And the theology is also very, very complex. Now a question about, or a point about this very, very complex, or let's say paradoxical attempt. We must understand that the resurgence of nationalism has to do with, obviously, reactions against globalization of every kind, cosmopolitanism indeed, and the kind of consequence it has had for economic inequality, for all kinds of very much problems of, if you wish, people felt left behind. And in the process, what is interesting is that all the attempts to go against the European Union, where you have basically evangelical Americans together with Russian Orthodox and right-wing Catholics that are against the Pope, but also right-wing secular movements, Le Pen, Republican Le Pen, or the Dutch, basically, that began as liberal, anti-Muslim, or for that matter, the Alternative in Germany, which is now capping the Christian nationalism in the US. And so you have this new interesting coalition. So it's a transnational movement to the defense of nationalism against the European Union that represents liberalism, secularism, etc., etc. So again, we must understand that we are in a very, very complex world in which also the old categories do not work anymore. And we have to open ourselves to basically trying to understand what is going on, that I, as a sociologist, can recognize. I'm not sure. I don't recognize it anymore. I'm as surprised as anybody. And so we have to be open to the kind of new dynamics which are being formed everywhere.
Elizabeth?
Okay, how to even follow that? But the point about us living in a new world, I agree. I mean, that's sort of where I started. That all the nice orderly both assumptions, but also structures and ideological underpinnings that have pretty much organized the world for the last at least 200 years, if not 400 years. I think they're being turned on their head. They're being critiqued and sort of reevaluated. But just 4 quick points. I mean, one is driven by Eric, your wonderful question: is there anything to be said about nationalism anymore? And I think what I take away from this conversation, but more generally, is that this kind of reinterrogation of how we make sense of the world in terms of ideational categories, and then we structured, is really all about a debate about what is community. What do we actually mean by community? whether we're talking in political terms or religious terms. How do we organize human community? How do we organize political community, religious community? And even more specifically than that, how do we organize in a way that addresses the profound inequalities and imbalances in power that have emerged from, this idea of the secular nation state as one that would not only produce order, but would somehow, equalize power globally. So I think the question of power and what faith communities have to contribute to what we might say about nation and the direction that nationalism might take, or nationalisms might take, has everything to do with this issue of power. The second thing, this idea of, maybe what Orthodoxy has to offer is a problematizing of kind of Catholicity. The issue of sort of the local and the global. If the local is the nation, the global may be the Catholic, the universal, or the ecumenical. How, again, to sort of make sense out of a world that still is organized according to the local, but is increasingly global as well. I think that's part of what we're seeing when it comes to nationalism, and whether we're seeing exclusivist religious forms of nationalism or religious communities talking about inclusive forms of political community or nationalism. The third point I would emphasize is the general reality of pluralism, that the debates about what we mean by national community and the religious valences of those debates really have everything to do with a world that is characterized by increasing religious diversity. And so pushback against that diversity comes oftentimes in the form of a discourse about exclusivist, about religiously particular nationalism, and it produces political arrangements and oftentimes violence and force that pushes back against that pluralism. And I think that is going to be the foundational question that all faith communities have to address in a world that, however, kind of imperfectly still remains organized according to the nation state. And if we think about what's happening in the United States, I mean, the reality of pluralism and religious diversity and the changing composition of religious diversity over the last 2 centuries has been part of what debates about the American nation have struggled with, and I think we're seeing that playing itself out now. Where the U.S. is concerned, though, I think it's possible in some ways to diffuse the highly charged conversations about religious diversity and inclusion or exclusion by placing things in more of a historical context. In some ways, the Protestant or now Judeo-Christian kind of cultural assumptions about American national identity, those are ones that have come through great contestation and oftentimes violence, but they're not. So if we look at those and look at our current moment, we'll see that debates about inclusion of Muslims and other faith communities, and also the very, very intense debates about believers and non-believers, atheists and believers. These are part of sort of the American experience. It doesn't make it any better, but what we do see is that we have historical periods on which to draw in order to ensure that those debates don't lead to social fragmentation and violence. And my concern, and I'll leave it here right now, is that some of the language that we hear in the United States over the last several decades, but in particular the active resort under this administration, but the reflexive response as well, to use identity politics and identity categories to talk about who belongs or who doesn't belong in a society that is increasingly weaponized and with a police force that's increasingly militarized, and where there are great economic imbalances. those are the things that produce, state breakdown and broader kinds of violence. And so thinking as a comparativist, seeing those in the American landscape is very, very concerning. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Eric?
Yeah, just maybe two quick comments and maybe even a brief question for anyone. I think the three of us, and I'll say this with my father in the background saying you always say this, is look, it's complicated. Religion is complicated. Religion and politics is complicated. There's not a kind of bumper sticker answer to these. But I think something that came through in Elizabeth and Jose's remarks too is that look, there's very different historical realities that have shaped the world, but they also, Christians have lived under empires, they lived under nation states, they lived under kingdoms, and maybe that complication and historicity can give us at least some room to not despair today, because it shows us there's nothing essential about this, and that human beings are, creative in kind of adjusting to different forms of life and having kind of agency in doing so. So that might be a kind of word of hope in at least in my world here in Princeton, New Jersey, some kind of despairing world right now. The other thing I'll say is, it's interesting that I think a great part of the mid-20th century Christian political thinkers that I mentioned, some of them, Jose mentioned some, I remember now also Joseph Ratzinger wrote an early book on the unity of the nations. They, obviously in the heels of the two world wars, were very concerned about international peace, and they devoted a lot of energy to international law and transnational organizations. Those institutions and movements now fall under criticism on the left and the right. On the right because of the kind of fear of globalism, on the left because of ways in which they were complicit with colonialism and global capital. But it's interesting that transnationalism used to be seen as a good thing, and nationalism was a dirty word. But now we have this transnationalism because of social media and because of other ways of global flow that rightly raises concerns about a kind of transnationalism in the service of radical right-wing nationalism. It's just kind of interesting on that sense. So one quick question, and I don't know if we have time here, but I think Elizabeth mainly spoke about Orthodox majority countries. But what's the state of, or how do Orthodox minorities think about nationalism, whether it's in the diaspora? I know Telly's written about this, or I'm thinking about, some of the post-Soviet republics where there's a kind of Muslim majority, or even places like India where there's a very tiny Orthodox minority. How would they fit into some of the models that Jose presented? Maybe they just fit under the kind of minority religion model that the European nation state civil religion has exported. But is there anything, quickly of note that you think of when thinking about, I know, thinking about the Greek Orthodox in America, highly valuing their kind of Greek identity and how they think about that vis-a-vis their American identity. But I'm also thinking about globally, these other perhaps less familiar countries, Azerbaijan or India.
I'll let Elizabeth handle that one. I have a thought about it, but
Yeah, sure. I think just one general observation. I think there's that's where we get to the pluralism within Orthodox communities. I think there's a huge. I know there are huge debates going on about the question of the relationship between religion and nationalism. I would say in the old world, for using kind of those historic terms, where Orthodox are living as minority communities in countries that are not democratic, they recognize that that rule of law and equality before the state is both a philosophical commitment and a theological commitment, but it's also a survival necessity. So that the notion of dominant, religiously informed, dominant, majoritarian forms of nation are ones that they do not support. I also think that the recognition that that the term secular and secular nationalism as a substitute for democratic is one that they have experienced is absolutely not the case. So whether we're talking about, the hyper secularist ideological experience of Bolshevism, or we're talking about, Jacobin style secular regimes of, Kemalist Turkey, the Orthodox minority populations understand that that's not, oftentimes compatible with a model of nationalism that's inclusive. And I think the same is holding true now for what's happening in India, where we're seeing this kind of Hindutva, exclusivist nationalism emerge. I would say in the U.S., you mentioned the U.S. And Orthodox Christians here being, very connected to their old world ethnic identities. Yes and no. I mean, we're talking about sort of by now 5 generations at least of Orthodox immigration to what is the United States, and so there's enormous difference, I think, within the Orthodox space about in the U.S. about the proper relationship between religion and nationalism. I think a lot of that maps onto the domestic political environment, and I'll leave it at that. But there's enormous, I would say, diversity and disagreement. And I would say, if you catch me on a positive day, healthy sort of disagreement. If you catch me on a less positive day, you won't catch me because I'll be banging my head into the wall right next to me. So anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Well, we have some questions here, and I want to maybe try to combine a couple of them. I'm not going to read them verbatim, and I'm going to try to maybe combine them with a question that I have. So I mean, this is going to be a couple of questions combined with something that I was thinking about as well. So one of the inspirations of this particular panel is just the kind of the thought that in some of the Orthodox countries, as you mentioned, I mean, these issues have been discussed even theologically, I mean, for quite a long time, and even in the diaspora communities as well. So it's not uncommon sort of to hear about sort of the Greek Orthodox atheists, right? I mean, I always tell this story where I was hearing a philosophy professor speak at this conference, and I turned to the organizer and I said, is this person Orthodox? And in kind of this Greek cultural way, she said, yeah, of course. And it was more like, of course, you idiot. I mean, of course he's Orthodox, which meant the fact that he, because he's Greek, he's Orthodox, right? And then about 15 minutes into his talk, I turned and asked her, and I said, does he believe in God? And she said, no. And, when I tell that to my students here in the United States, they're very, very confused about that. But, and this is sort of getting to my question and a little bit of a combination of some of the questions I'm seeing on the side. Is it the case that we're starting to see that type of American, so to speak, right? And I'm referring to I have it here. I'm sorry. This book, Taking America Back for God, which recently came out, and José, was the Berkeley Center had I think a panel on this, a webinar on this very recently. And in this book, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry, I mean, they see this kind of Christian nationalism in America on this kind of sliding scale. And I guess one could say the extreme of one side of the scale is this nationalist, this kind of Christian nationalist that's not, religion isn't really important. And I guess, again, one of the inspirations for this is that I guess that surprised me as well in the United States, that has been sort of, that has emerged, right? And so I guess the question I want to ask, and maybe some of you can comment on it, I mean, has it always been there? I mean, and it's just sort of now emerging. If that's the case, what's the goal? All right. I mean, what is the goal? I mean, José, you speak about this a little bit in your book, Public Religions, where, the goal of the moral majority, for example, in the 80s was not necessarily the 70s and the 80s is not really a theocracy. Although in the Orthodox world, the goal for some religious nationalists is a theocracy, for some on the extreme side. But the goal is very particular to the United States in the sense of being perhaps a return to some idealized 1950s, some moral disestablishment, moral establishment, perhaps. So just, it's a little bit of a two-part question in the sense of, is this explicit sort of manifestation of this kind of religious nationalist in America something new, or has it always been kind of there? And what's the goal? And there's just a footnote here, because just a footnote, this relates a little bit to Eric's question about the diaspora, because in the diaspora here in the United States anyway, or maybe not so much the diaspora, because there's many converts to Orthodoxy, and there's wonderful work being done by a woman who was a fellow for our center, Sarah Riccardi Schwartz, and now she's at the Center for Religion and Conflict at University of Arizona. But she's doing some wonderful work indicating that there's a kind of nationalism within some of these row core communities and Orthodox communities that's kind of this weird hybrid of American and transnational. It's kind of like, it's like American in the sense of being pro-Russian, right? I mean, which is kind of a weird sort of religious nationalism, I guess, right? Anyway, that was just a footnote, but back to my question, which is combining a couple of questions here coming. If someone wants to come, maybe Jose, you want to just comment on this American sort of religious national, is it something
Very
new?
briefly,
What's their goal? Yeah.
Very weakly, 3 points by way of linking to the atheist. There's the famous anecdote that Peter Berger would always tell about Northern Ireland, how somebody goes from a Protestant to a Catholic or vice versa. And then somebody says, hands up, what are you, Catholic or Protestant? No, I'm an atheist, but which one? Every atheist, of course, is a denial of some particular God, Catholic, Protestant, or whatever. So you have Confucian atheists, you have Muslim atheists, you have Jewish atheists. The same thing with secular. There's nothing as a secularist. You are either an ex-Catholic, ex-Protestant, ex-whatever. So this is a point. Then again, French Catholic nationalism, André Malraux, Action Française, Catholic fascism. He was an atheist, but he was the leader of Catholic nationalism against the Republic. And today you have that most of the defenders of Christian nationalism in Europe themselves are, if not atheists, certainly not practitioners, not really religious believers. They are really secular European nationalists that defend Christianity as the culture of Europe against Islam. So again, in America, there has been nativism, right? Nativism, it begins with the Ku Klux Klan against Mormons, against Catholics. It was not against blacks. The Ku Klux Klan started against Catholics, against Mormons, against Masons. This was the original enemies of the Ku Klux Klan when it started. And nativism was directed, against Catholics originally for many, many decades. And now it has turned, so nativism, of course, the question of that a group defines we are the natives, although of course in American natives, the natives were the WASP, they were never the American Indians or the blacks that had been here longer than they were the WASP who were the natives. So you have a defense of this nativism that we define the nation in those terms. And this nativism, today you find it also in Europe everywhere, in the name of Christianity, when it is totally secular nation. So again, those dynamics are complex. So you have all versions, the non-nothing movement, basically in the 1850s, against immigration, against Catholics, particularly. But today has a different, it's not against Catholics, it's obviously it's more racist. It's the WASP, but in the sense of white and Anglo-Saxon more than Protestant.
Thank you. I don't know if any of you two want to. Yeah, Eric, you want to comment on that?
Just quickly, I mean, the phenomena you were describing, I think we're familiar with Judaism, speaking about that in kind of secular Jews, cultural Jews. Partly, I think, because particularly Protestantism has so defined itself by a center around beliefs rather than practices, it sometimes is more unfamiliar. So I think what's becoming more legible is the extent to which Protestant cultural symbolics are just so big and everywhere that, you know, it's attachment to whiteness, it's attachment to, you know, maybe the kind of 1950s nostalgia, to misogyny. So what I find interesting is, you know, a lot of the Christian nationalists don't go to church, you know, so it's kind of similar to what Jose was talking about. Not that church attendance has ever been very high in actuality in America, but some people have actually argued what we're witnessing is the rise of a kind of post-Christian religious right, and that we may long for the days of the old moral majority that had some constraints built in, at least to the extent it was sort of, it paid tribute to certain, you know, Christian values and virtues, that it sort of thought it had to attend to the whole Bible, including care for the least of these, rather than a kind of the kind of maybe nativist streak that Jose was talking about, really emerging with a kind of viciousness that, you know, many people maybe saw the old religious right had, but yeah, I'm not a sociologist, but you know, if there is a kind of post-religious, post-Christian religious right emerging, you know, which have its own forms, which will look different than Pat Robertson.
Right. Elizabeth, I don't know if you have a comment, or we can go to other questions, or okay.
Go on.
Yeah, we have like, that's just maybe 5 more minutes, because we built it 5 to 6, but I could, you know, I tweeted this as a happy hour conversation, and I just, you know, I wish actually we were at a bar talking more.
I only have Perrier. You know,
I wish we were, so we can go on. I could, you know, even pre-COVID, you could go on for a couple hours here talking about all these wonderful issues. And but let me give a question to each of you from the list, and maybe just a very quick comment, if you can, as we can wrap up this up. And again, we're having a part 2 on November 5th, so people can come back and we can continue to explore some of these issues. But Eric, let me throw one to you first, just very quickly. I have a question here. Given the extent of religious nationalism, what scriptural and theological justification do its advocates invoke to substantiate the intimate association of religion, nation, state? Maybe just a quick comment.
Yeah, well, I sort of, you know, in the interest of time, cut out all my biblical references, when except for I did mention Acts 17, which is sometimes mentioned, where there's a kind of divine distribution of the borders of the world. And, you know, many people, regardless whether or not they're religious nationalists, again, they think it's kind of good for justice to have borders and a kind of common good, and, you know, we're not kind of a hollow cosmopolitanism. But yeah, Acts 17. I think some of the other scriptural passages from, again, I mentioned Revelation, when it talks about nations gathering together, and some of the table of nations in the book of Genesis. So you could read those as sort of literary, or you could read those as literal. But part of my question was like, what do we think about them now? I think the most kind of prominent verse in American liberal Protestantism is that there's neither Jew nor Greek. There's a kind of vision of Christianity as this kind of universalism that swallows up all of our particular identities. But, you know, again, that's kind of problematic when you think, well, what does it mean to be an African-American Christian? Or what does it mean to be an Asian-American Christian? And how we think about that passage. So there's, as with most things, there's a lot in the Bible, and you can pretty much do with it what you want to do with it.
Yeah. So Jose, let me throw you a question. This has something to do with sort of religion and secularism as it's playing out in Turkey. So the question goes, and it has sort of a global, perspective to it. So the Turkish state is now a threat to orthodoxy once again. Erdogan is persecuting his minorities, particularly His All Holiness Bartholomew and the Armenian Church and the people of Armenia by proxy in Azerbaijan. Do you think this will bring about more nationalism in the Orthodox countries? And maybe I can reframe it or just add a little bit to it. I mean, do you think that this is just another example of the way in which, as you said, like everything's changing? So now kind of religion and nationalism is affecting geopolitics in a way that perhaps people didn't expect.
Well, I can say those are very dangerous dynamics, because he's not only using it for the purpose of Turkish nationalism, but for the purpose of presenting himself as a kind of leader of geopolitical Islam for the rest of the Muslim world. And we saw how today he responded to Macron. As you know, you had the attack by this basically person against people in this cathedral in Nice. And then you have basically the reaffirmation of French laïcité. France has been attacked. Our principles have been attacked. We have to defend our sacred symbols, laïcité, freedom of expression, and then the response of, on the part of Erdogan. So you have these dynamics which are very dangerous in our global world, because nationalisms usually, again, nationalisms, when you have to this point, they are developed either against the internal enemy, this is what fascism was, right? Either religious minorities or racial minorities or those who are not fully us and we don't want them. So close the wall, basically ban the Muslims, or they are against the others in geopolitical, in real conflicts, right? And so this is the problem with this. I mean, obviously Erdogan is playing with fire. Obviously it works for a while for him, for his nationalism, but there are limits to it. Unfortunately, much of the Turkish public, as we've seen when there have been possibility of elections, don't fall for it. So my hope is that ultimately it's an attempt on his part to regain the kind of central power that he had, but it's not clear that it is going to work within Turkey ultimately, but certainly it's dangerous on the geopolitical level.
Yeah. Elizabeth, one for you. We'll end here, and I apologize to others who had questions. We had some really good ones, I mean, about evangelicals and vote, you know, climate change, which we really didn't talk about, and its relationship to religion and nationalism, and some really good questions here. Hopefully we can take up and will come up in part 2. But so, and this one is actually, it says this question is mainly for Elizabeth. So it's a little bit long, Elizabeth, but let me kind of throw it out to you and for your quick response. So in emphasizing the importance of democracy for negotiating the relationship between religion and nationalism, do you have in mind liberal democracy as defined by a commitment to a robust regime of individual rights, including religious freedom, as opposed to pure majoritarian democracy? If so, is a commitment to a particular conception of democracy really doing the work for navigating the relationship between religion and nationalism, as opposed to democracy itself, such that prior theoretical commitments will in some sense determine how we frame and answer questions about religion and nationalism? So I think the question is, well, there's one last part. Or in emphasizing the importance of democracy, do you make room for populism, which we haven't really touched on, which is something really important to this discussion? If so, how do we think about the position of religious minorities? So if I'm recapping, if I'm doing justice to the question, sort of majoritarian democracy versus liberal democracy in relationship to top populism and religious minorities.
Oh, okay. So you want me to answer that quickly?
Yeah, you have to. We're already at 6:17, but yeah, just give
right. Okay. So I guess I'll take a cop-out approach, and I'll say that the prefix that we place before democracy very much has an impact on how you can negotiate that relationship between the religious community and the political community, between religion and nationalism. I think that and again, some may see this as a cop-out, but first of all, I would not use liberalism and democracy interchangeably, because I think that, again, the emphasis on the individual and oftentimes the exclusion of rights of communities becomes problematic in liberalism. If you look at the UDHR, for example, or Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or International Covenant, or European Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, you can see that where freedom of conscience, belief, and religion are discussed, they're discussed in terms of individual rights and the rights of communities. And so I think, you know, democracy itself it's a changing, a changing animal. Democracy as a regime type transforms over time, but I think striking that balance between individual and group rights is absolutely important. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. With populism, I'm not sure if I quite understood, if I quite understand the question, but one thing I think, and this goes back to everything we've been discussing, one thing in the big debates in democracy are, do democracies have the right to self-destruct? And what are the limitations that are acceptable in, democratic regimes on on actions and ideas that can produce the destruction of democracy. And some might say that that's populism itself, but I'll leave it there. So
This is great. I mean, we all know that with our centers after, post-COVID, or what post-COVID means, that, we're going to do more webinars, but I think next time, if we do a webinar together, we're all going to be together at a table with some wine or beer or something, because I can see this conversation going on and on and on, and whoever wants to stay and listen and ask questions and participate, that's fine, because this is such a rich discussion. You all offer such great insights and wisdom and really interesting perspectives. Like I said, we can go on, and I have the benefit of knowing all three of you, so I in one way or another, it is going to continue, and I'm looking forward to that very, very much. I don't know if any of you have like a final, just kind of want to get something in there really quickly, comment or anything on that. Anybody?
Only thank you, and I will remember your offer of a conversation around a table with wine.
As long as you bring Spanish wine, we'll be all set, and I'll bring the Greek
Okay,
wine.
good.
All right. Well, listen, thank you very, very much. Again, I want to just very quickly, again, remind everybody of part 2 of this panel, again, with the Center for Religion, the Center on Religion and Culture. And it's, I didn't really give I keep calling it Religion and Nationalism Part 2, but actually the title is Trump, Biden, and the Future of Christian Nationalism. So it's a post-election discussion. I know in the description of this event, we said we'd talk about the election. We didn't, because there's so many things to talk about, but we can kind of bring those kind of questions into part 2. And the three of you, we invite you to join us for that and continue.
Kelly, could I just mention one thing for 10 seconds? Mainly because we talked so much about Trump, or I did. The theme of Biden's campaign, restoring the soul of the nation. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of it's a kind of invocation of the American civil religion, and the soul of the nation is a part of what Biden is using, again, in a kind of I think effort to kind of restore the character of the nation, not a kind of theological notion of the soul. But it's just interesting to note that the Democratic Party is also using this language of the soul of the nation.
And there was a recent New York Times op-ed piece about that. Biden and Trump say they're fighting for America's soul. What does that mean? And you have a comment in there. And the thing that struck me about that particular article was that the Democrats now are starting to kind of draw on this kind of language too. So all we can say is stay tuned. It's an evolving conversation. As Jose says, a new situation, new categories. I mean, if Jose is being caught by surprise, imagine everybody else. So anyway, we can go on and on. And Elizabeth, do you have a final?
Can we submit questions for the next panel? Because I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we think it's helpful to unpacking the relationship between religion and nationalism to be mainstreaming the term Christian nationalism? Because to me, it has the same sort of lightning rod features as using, Islamism. Take your religious tradition or that you wish, but
send it to me and I'll send it to David Gibson.
Okay.
Who will be moderating that panel. So again, this was great. Great seeing you all. Wish you safety and all the best, and we'll be in touch. Thank you to everyone who participated and joined us, and good night. Good night to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.